You know that feeling when you stumble across a photograph from history and it hits you like a punch to the gut, not because of what you see, but because of what you realize nobody told you about. That's what happened to me when I first learned about the Burma Campaign. Here was one of the most brutal, desperate, and world-changing struggles of the Second World War, and it lived in the shadows of every history book I'd ever read. The jungles of Southeast Asia between 1942 and 1945 became a killing ground that devoured hundreds of thousands of lives. British soldiers, American volunteers, Chinese troops, Indian regiments, Japanese invaders, and local populations all collided in a nightmare of disease, hunger, and combat that makes you question everything you think you know about how wars are actually fought and won. But here's what haunts me the most. While we celebrate D-Day, while we memorize the Pacific Island hopping campaigns, while we study the European theater in exhaustive detail, the Burma Campaign remains the forgotten hell, the invisible war, the campaign that shaped a post-war world more than most people realize, yet it barely registers in our collective memory. Why? That's the question that pulled me down this rabbit hole, and what I discovered changed how I understand courage, sacrifice, and the true price of freedom. So let me ask you directly. What if I told you that some of the most vicious fighting of World War II happened in a place so remote, so hostile, that soldiers didn't just fear the enemy? They feared the very ground beneath their feet. They feared the rain. They feared the darkness. They feared the invisible things that killed more men than bullets ever could. And what if those forgotten battles determined whether Japan could hold an empire stretching across half the world, or whether that empire would collapse under the weight of its own ambition? This is the story of the Burma Campaign. It's a story about 5 nations at war. It's about logistics and stubbornness. It's about generals making impossible decisions. It's about ordinary soldiers pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance. And it's about why this campaign matters to you right now in 2025 more than you probably realize. Let me set the stage. It's late 1941, and the Japanese military machine is unstoppable. They'd conquered Manchuria, China, and they're hungry for more. They see Southeast Asia as their birthright. Burma, specifically, sits like a jewel on their maps. Why? Because Burma controls access to the supply routes into China. Burma controls the China-Burma-India theater. And if Japan can secure Burma, they can strangle Chinese resistance and potentially threaten India itself. For the Allies, losing Burma isn't just a military defeat. It's a catastrophe that echoes across every strategic calculation of the entire war. By January 1942, Japanese forces are pouring into Burma. They move with the speed and precision that terrified everyone who faced them. British forces, caught unprepared in a theater nobody expected would become a major battleground, are forced into a desperate retreat. And here's where it gets real. The retreat from Burma becomes one of the longest, most harrowing military retreats in British history. Thousands of soldiers, administrators, and civilians flee northward into the jungle. Some don't make it. They're captured, they're killed, or they simply vanish into the green. Can you imagine that? Imagine being part of an army that's not fighting to win, but just trying to survive long enough to escape. The jungle itself becomes the third combatant in this war, and it's merciless. The monsoon rains fall like curtains, creating rivers where there were dirt roads. The humidity wraps around you like a living thing, making every breath feel like you're drowning on land. The temperature soars past 110 degrees. And then there's the malaria, the dengue fever, the dysentery, the jungle parasites that burrow under your skin. More soldiers died from disease in Burma than from combat. By some estimates, for every man killed in battle, 5 more died from sickness. That's a statistic that should make your blood run cold, 5 to 1. The enemy isn't just the soldier in the opposite trench. The enemy is your own body giving up. But as 1942 turns into 1943, something shifts. The Allies refuse to concede Burma to the Japanese. Instead, they make a decision that reveals something profound about human will and determination. They decide to fight back, not with overwhelming force, not with technology they don't have, but with strategy, resilience, and a willingness to meet the Japanese on their own terms in their own nightmare landscape. Enter General William Slim. If you've never heard of him, you're about to understand why British military history speaks of him with reverence. Slim wasn't a glamorous commander. He wasn't the type to make dramatic speeches or seek glory. He was something rare. He was a thinking general. A general who understood that in Burma, conventional warfare couldn't work, that if you tried to fight a neat European-style war in the jungle would kill you before the enemy even got a chance. Slim's philosophy was revolutionary for its time. He insisted that his troops would hold ground, they wouldn't retreat. Even when surrounded, even when supply lines seemed impossible, even when the jungle pressed in from every direction, they would hold. And to do that, Slim pioneered a strategy of aerial resupply, planes dropping food, ammunition, and medicine from the sky. It sounds obvious now, but in 1943, it was borderline insane. How do you supply an army cut off in the jungle by airplane? How do you land supplies safely? How do you ensure they reach the men who need them? The answer involved courage beyond measure. American pilots, British transport crews, Indian ground personnel all worked together in an operation that would become the template for every modern airborne logistics operation. When you look at how armies are supplied today, when you see video of cargo drops to soldiers in remote locations, you're watching a legacy of what they learned in Burma. You're watching an innovation born from desperation and stubbornness. But let's talk about the Japanese perspective, because understanding them is crucial to understanding this campaign. The Japanese commanders in Burma weren't incompetent, they weren't weak. They were operating under a strategic doctrine that had won them incredible victories across Southeast Asia. The doctrine was simple. Strike hard, move fast, destroy the enemy's will to fight, and for a while it worked beautifully. But Burma was different. The supply lines were longer. The terrain was more hostile. The enemy was developing tactics specifically designed to counter Japanese strengths. General Masaki Honda commanded the Japanese forces, and he faced an impossible situation. Tokyo demanded victory. His troops demanded basic supplies. And the jungle demanded that everyone who fought in it pay a price in blood and suffering. By mid-1943, the strategic initiative was shifting. The Allies, despite their earlier defeats, were beginning to stabilize. The Americans, through military intelligence, were learning Japanese patterns. The British were adapting. The Chinese nationalist forces in Burma, supplied through the legendary Burma Road, were becoming more effective. And the Indians, the Indian Army, fighting under the British flag, demonstrated capabilities that would later help forge India's independence. The irony isn't lost on me. British soldiers and Indian soldiers were literally fighting and dying together to defend the British Empire, even as that empire was collapsing. Here's a micro-hook for you. What if I told you that one of the most pivotal moments of the entire Burma campaign turned on a decision made by a Japanese general who was operating with almost no support from Tokyo? What if the outcome of whether Burma stayed in Japanese hands or returned to Allied control hinged on logistics and luck more than military genius? In 1944, the Japanese launched Operation U-Go. It was a desperate attempt to break through Allied lines, capture the supply base at Imphal in India, and force the Allies to concede Burma. On paper, it looked possible. Japanese forces had achieved miracles before. Maybe they could do it again. But the math was working against them now. The Allies had built up supplies. They had more men. They had air superiority. And crucially, they had learned how to fight in the jungle. The Battle of Imphal became one of the war's strangest engagements. Japanese forces actually managed to surround the city. They cut supply lines. They fought with fanatical courage, and for a terrifying moment, the Allies genuinely didn't know if they could hold. But here's where aerial resupply proved its worth. Planes flew supplies in, while Japanese fighters tried to shoot them down. The Allies, those surrounded, never starved. They never ran out of ammunition, and slowly, carefully, methodically, they pushed the Japanese back. The casualty figures are staggering. At Imphal alone, tens of thousands died. Many Japanese soldiers died from starvation and disease, not combat. Their supply situation was so desperate that some Japanese units resorted to eating their own horses, and when the horses ran out, things became unspeakable. Imagine that. Imagine being a soldier so far from home, so cut off that your stomach becomes your enemy. That's the reality of the Burma Campaign that most histories gloss over. But here's where it gets even more complex. The Allies didn't just win at Imphal through military superiority. They won because Japanese command made a fateful decision. After months of brutal fighting, after enormous casualties, after realizing that Operation U-Go wasn't going to break the Allied will, the Japanese commanders withdrew. They accepted defeat. Not because they were forced to, but because they recognized that continuing would only produce more deaths with zero chance of success. It's a moment of military wisdom that's rare in warfare, the willingness to say, this isn't working. We need to retreat and preserve what we can. By 1944, the strategic picture in Burma was becoming clear. The Allies would win. The question wasn't if, but when and at what cost. American forces under General Joseph Stilwell, working with Chinese nationalist troops, began pushing northward from India, aiming to reopen the Burma Road and restore the supply line to China. British forces under Slim pushed eastward and southward, aiming to clear Japanese forces from the country entirely. And now we come to one of the most extraordinary military operations of the entire war, the Chindits. If you've never heard of them, prepare to have your mind blown. The Chindits were a special operations unit created by a British eccentric named Orde Wingate. Wingate believed that conventional warfare couldn't work in Burma. He believed that small, mobile units operating behind Japanese lines could disrupt supply lines, gather intelligence, and prove that Japanese forces weren't invincible. The Chindits were composed of British soldiers, Burmese fighters, and volunteers from across the Commonwealth. They were trained specifically for jungle warfare. They moved light, fast, and they lived off the land as much as possible. In 1943, they conducted their first raid, penetrating deep behind Japanese lines and causing havoc before withdrawing. It was a stunning success, and it proved Wingate's theory. You could operate effectively in the Burmese jungle if you trained and prepared correctly. The second Chindit operation was larger and more ambitious. Thousands of men were inserted deep behind Japanese lines. They had minimal supplies. They carried radios, weapons, and medicine. Their mission was to establish strongholds deep in enemy territory, disrupt Japanese operations, and support the main Allied offensive. And for months, these men lived in the jungle like ghosts. They fought Japanese patrols. They gathered intelligence. They endured disease and hunger. Some of them didn't come out alive. Wingate himself died in a plane crash in 1944, never seeing the full fruits of his operation. But the Chindits proved something fundamental. They showed that the Japanese weren't militarily invincible. They showed that the Allies could adapt and innovate. And they showed that some men possess a level of courage and endurance that borders on the superhuman. Let me paint you a picture of what daily life was like for these soldiers. You wake up in the dark, drenched in sweat. The humidity has soaked through everything you own. Your clothes, already in tatters, cling to your skin. You check your body for leeches. You peel them off if you find them. Your feet are perpetually wet, rotting from the constant moisture. Every step causes pain. But you don't stop. You can't stop. Stopping means you die. You eat if you have food. Usually it's rice and whatever you can catch or trade from locals. Water is everywhere, but it's all contaminated. You drink it anyway because you're more afraid of dehydration than dysentery. You smoke if you have cigarettes, because the smoke supposedly keeps mosquitoes away, though nobody really knows if that's true. You apply insect repellent that doesn't work. You watch your friends get sick. You know some of them won't recover. And you keep moving because that's all you can do. At night, you hear things, sounds from the jungle you can't identify, animals, rain, wind in the trees, maybe Japanese patrols, maybe nothing. Your mind plays tricks on you after weeks of this. You see shapes that aren't there. You hear voices. The jungle gets into your head and never leaves. The monsoon season is worse than anything you could imagine. Rain doesn't fall. It descends. It falls in sheets so thick you can't see 10 feet ahead. Rivers overflow their banks. Paths become rivers themselves. Your equipment gets heavier as it absorbs water. Your body gets weaker from malaria and dysentery. And you keep moving because stopping means death. And at this point, death is starting to look less like an enemy and more like mercy. By 1945, the Japanese military in Burma was in its death throes. They'd been pushed back steadily. Supply lines had been cut. The dream of an extended Japanese empire in Southeast Asia was crumbling, and yet some units continued to fight with a fanaticism that defied logic. They fought because retreat was considered dishonor. They fought because they'd been indoctrinated to believe that surrender was death anyway. They fought because sometimes human beings will persist in hopeless situations, because hope, even irrational hope, is all they have left. The liberation of Rangoon in May 1945 was a moment of immense significance, even though it came after VE Day in Europe. Rangoon was the capital of Burma, the symbolic prize that the Japanese had seized in 1942. When Allied forces advancing from the north and south finally entered the city, it marked the end of Japanese rule in Burma, but it also marked something else. It marked the beginning of a new era, because Burma, once it was liberated from Japanese occupation, wasn't simply going to slip back into British colonial rule. The independence movement that had been suppressed during the war would explode into the post-war world. This is a crucial part of the story that many histories miss. The Burma Campaign wasn't just a military struggle between two powers fighting for dominance. It was also the crucible in which Burmese nationalism was forged. The Burmese people had experienced Japanese occupation. They'd seen that the Japanese weren't gods. They'd also watched as the British and Americans fought to push the Japanese out. And they'd drawn a conclusion that terrified the British. They weren't grateful for liberation. They were ready for independence. The military achievement of the Burma Campaign was significant. The Allies had reconquered a territory about the size of Texas from a fanatical enemy in terrain that seemed designed by nature to defeat armies. They'd learned new methods of warfare. They demonstrated that innovation, adaptation, and sheer determination could overcome seemingly overwhelming obstacles. But the political outcome was even more significant. Burma would gain independence from Britain in 1948, just 3 years after the campaign ended. India would gain independence in 1947. The age of European colonialism in Asia was collapsing, and the Burma campaign had accelerated that collapse. Let me ask you something. Do you realize how many of the geopolitical situations you see in news today trace back to decisions made during World War II in places like Burma? The relationship between Burma and China, rooted in this war. The role of American military power in Southeast Asia. This campaign was the template. The role of India as a military power. This campaign proved Indian soldiers could stand alongside the best troops in the world. The human cost of the Burma campaign is staggering. Approximately 102,000 Allied soldiers died or went missing. Of those, about 100,000 were from disease and accidents, not combat. Japanese casualties were even worse. Over 300,000 Japanese soldiers died in Burma, with the vast majority from starvation and disease. Civilian casualties are harder to quantify, but historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of Burmese civilians died from hunger, disease, and the general devastation of war. Think about that number for a moment. Hundreds of thousands of people died in Burma during this campaign, and most people today have never even heard of it. If you asked a random person on the street to name the major campaigns of World War II, would they mention Burma? Probably not. They'd say D-Day. They'd say the Pacific Island Hopping Campaign. They'd say the Eastern Front. But Burma would be forgotten. This is the tragedy that compelled me to make this video. History has a tendency to forget the stories that don't fit neatly into our preferred narratives. But let's talk about individual stories, because that's where the real impact of this campaign lives. General William Slim, the architect of the Allied victory, survived the war and went on to become a respected figure in British military history. But imagine the burden he carried, knowing that decisions he made sent thousands of men to probable death in a remote jungle. knowing that some of those decisions didn't work out perfectly. The weight of that kind of responsibility is unimaginable. There's also the story of the ordinary soldier who experienced things in Burma that they'd never speak about for the rest of their lives. Veterans would return home and struggle to explain what they'd endured. How do you tell someone who's never been there what it feels like when your body is covered in jungle sores and you're shivering from fever and your best friend died from dysentery 3 days ago and you're still supposed to fight? How do you explain the smell of the jungle rotting everything? How do you convey the psychological weight of constant exposure to death? Many Burma veterans came home with what we now call PTSD, though they didn't have a name for it then. They had nightmares. They had difficulty sleeping. They had difficulty adjusting to normal life. And because the campaign itself was underappreciated, these veterans often felt that their suffering had been for nothing. The campaign was forgotten, so their sacrifice was forgotten. That's a particular kind of cruelty. There's another dimension to this campaign that we haven't fully explored yet: the role of intelligence and technology. The Allies used radio technology that was revolutionary for its time. They coordinated supply drops and tactical movements across thousands of miles of jungle using radios carried by hand. They broke Japanese codes and were able to anticipate Japanese movements. They used aerial reconnaissance to map territory that had never been properly surveyed before. The Allies also learned from their mistakes. Early in the campaign, when they tried to fight a conventional war against a superior enemy in unfamiliar terrain, they got slaughtered, but they adapted. They changed tactics. They developed countermeasures to Japanese strategies. This process of learning and adaptation is one of the defining characteristics of the Allied victory in Burma. It's a lesson that applies to modern military strategy and to modern problem solving in general. If you want to win against a formidable opponent in an unfamiliar landscape, you need to be willing to adapt. Now, let me connect this to the modern world. What if I told you that the lessons of the Burma campaign are directly relevant to understanding how nations respond to modern crises? The pandemic, for instance. Nations had to adapt on the fly, improvise solutions, and accept that not everything would work perfectly. Some nations responded better than others, just like some armies adapted better to jungle warfare than others. The nations that won were the ones that learned fastest and adapted most flexibly. This is the legacy of the Burma campaign. It teaches us that humans can endure incredible hardship if they're properly led and motivated. It teaches us that adaptation and innovation matter more than raw power. And it teaches us that sacrifice, even when forgotten, still shapes the world. Let me describe one more scene from Burma that captures the absolute horror and the absolute humanity of this campaign simultaneously. It's 1944. A British patrol has been cut off from supplies for weeks. They're deep in enemy territory. One of the soldiers has malaria so severe that he can barely walk. The unit has to move, but the soldier can't keep pace. They have a choice: carry him, which slows down the entire unit and might get everyone killed, or leave him behind. What do? In this case, they carry him. They fashion a stretcher from bamboo and cloth. 6 men rotate carrying him, while the other 6 provide security and scout ahead. They lose time. They move slower. They take more risks, but they keep him with them. He survives, and this is repeated over and over throughout the campaign. Soldiers making a choice to look after their mates, even when it costs them. It's a small thing, but it's the most important thing. It's the thing that separates us from the things we're fighting against. The Burma campaign represents the absolute extreme of human endurance and sacrifice. It's a campaign that proves that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the stakes are high enough and when they're properly led. It's also a campaign that proves that the most important victories are often the ones that nobody remembers or celebrates. The soldiers who fought in Burma didn't fight for glory or recognition. Many of them probably didn't even understand the strategic importance of what they were doing. They fought because they were ordered to. They fought because their mates were there. They fought because survival required it. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, Burma was fully under Allied control. The campaign was over, though the dying from disease and injuries continued for months as wounded soldiers were evacuated and recovered. The Japanese military, which had seemed invincible just years earlier, had been completely expelled from Southeast Asia. The age of Japanese expansion had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, as supply lines dwindled and starvation set in. What happened after the campaign ended is equally important to the campaign itself. The independence movements in Asia, emboldened by the success of the Allies and by their experience during the war, pushed for immediate independence. Burma got it in 1948, India got it in 1947, the Dutch East Indies became Indonesia, the French tried to hold Indochina and failed. The age of European colonialism in Asia was finished. This is the true legacy of the Burma Campaign. It's not just a military victory. It's the campaign that began the transformation of the entire world political order. The veterans of the Burma Campaign lived with their memories for the rest of their lives. Some never spoke about it. Some wrote memoirs. Some became advocates for veterans' benefits and mental health services. They'd seen things that changed them permanently. They'd endured hardships that shaped their entire character. And many of them, in their later years, finally felt compelled to share their stories so that future generations would understand what had happened and why it mattered. As we look at the Burma Campaign today, over 70 years later, we have to ask ourselves why we forgot it in the first place. Part of the answer is that the campaign didn't fit neatly into the narratives we preferred. Europe was where the real war was, we told ourselves. The Pacific was where the drama was. Burma was too remote, too complicated, too miserable. It didn't have the clean victory of D-Day or the technological spectacle of the island-hopping campaign. It was a grinding, muddy, disease-ridden slog that didn't end in surrender ceremonies or iconic photographs, so we forgot it. But that's precisely why we need to remember it. The Burma Campaign teaches us that sometimes the most important victories are the ones that don't get celebrated. It teaches us that ordinary soldiers, placed in extraordinary circumstances, can achieve things that seem impossible. It teaches us that leadership matters, that adaptation matters, that the will to survive and the willingness to sacrifice for your mates matter more than any technology or strategy. The campaign also teaches us something about the fragility of empire. The Japanese thought they could build an empire stretching across half of Asia. The British thought their colonial empire was permanent. Both were wrong. Empires crumble. Power shifts. The strong become weak. The weak find strength. This is the eternal lesson of history, and Burma teaches it better than almost any other campaign. If you're watching this and you've gotten this far, you're already different than you were when we started. You've learned something that most people don't know. You understand that World War II was far more complex than the simplified narratives we're usually taught. You understand that there were multiple wars within the war, multiple struggles, multiple stories of courage and sacrifice, and you understand that history has victims, not just in terms of casualties, but also in terms of forgotten stories. The soldiers who fought in Burma, both Allied and Japanese, deserve to be remembered. The civilians who suffered deserve to be remembered. The leaders who made the strategic decisions, both brilliant and flawed, deserve to be remembered. This campaign shaped the world you live in today. It determined that Japan wouldn't control a massive Asian empire. It demonstrated that the age of European colonialism was ending. It proved that innovation and adaptation could overcome seemingly impossible odds. These aren't abstract historical facts. These are the foundations of the world you inhabit. So remember Burma. When you think about World War II, don't just think about the beaches of Normandy or the jungles of the Pacific. Think about Burma. Think about soldiers soaked in rain and covered in jungle sores. Think about the disease that killed more men than bullets. Think about General Slim's determination to hold ground against all odds. Think about the Chindits operating behind enemy lines. Think about the ordinary people who did extraordinary things in a place so remote and so hostile that nature itself seemed to be fighting against them. This is why this campaign matters. This is why it deserves to be remembered, not because it was the biggest or the most glamorous campaign of the war, but because it captures something fundamental about human nature. It shows us what we're capable of when pushed to the absolute limits. It shows us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite the fear. It shows us that sacrifice, even when unrecognized, still shapes the future. The Burma Campaign stands as testament to millions of people who endured the impossible so that we could live in a world where colonialism was finally recognized as wrong, where nations could be independent, where the rule of law could eventually triumph over the rule of force. It's a legacy that deserves to be remembered.